Everyone, I'm Matthew Gibson. I'm the Executive Director of Virginia Humanities. And actually, you're sitting in Virginia Humanities right now, which is pretty cool. This is our Public Humanities Center. So when we think about the humanities a lot, we hear about the decline of the humanities in higher education. I actually see the public humanities, things like the Festival of the Book, as a sign that the public humanities are actually quite vibrant and thriving. So I'm really glad for you all to be here today to help us make it thrive. I want to welcome you to the 29th Annual Virginia Festival of the Book, and I'm, of course, really excited for you all to be here and for this to be happening. So while today is the official kickoff of the 4-day festival, the festivities themselves have actually been going on for a little while with pre-festival events. These have been in different parts. Come on in, if you're here for the Festival of the Book. But if you're not, you can come in too. Good to see you. So there have been pre-festival events that have been happening across the state in different parts. Everything from supporting and working with the Origin Project down in Washington County to have a panel with Barbara Kingsolver. We're very sorry we couldn't get Barbara up here. But we've also been in Richmond, Stanton, Nelson County, Richmond. And what we're trying to do with this is actually think about the Virginia Festival of the Book and actually taking the Virginia Festival of the Book to other parts of Virginia and sharing book culture and books with other folks. And I want to thank personally David and Michelle Baldacci for helping us do those pre-festival events. So before I hand this panel off to our moderator Bill Adams and speaker Nicholas Reynolds, I just want to recognize a few folks. First, of course, all of you. Without you being here, there would be no festival. And I know many of you have been festival goers, supporters for many years, and I want to thank you for continuing to be that. Second, our contractors, Ray Nedsel, Dana Ainsworth, Paul Guest, who helped us plan our panels and organize the logistics of the events around town, and our very many volunteers who read the books and helped us plan who would actually be on these panels. Third, our major financial supporters, in particular, our literary leaders. You can actually see a listing of our literary leaders at the back of your book here. You will find listing in the back, and of course the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation, who also helped support the creation of this public humanities space. I would love for you to explore it afterwards if you feel free. That'd be great. I also want to thank our long partnership with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. Virginia Humanities serves the Commonwealth primarily as an educational institution. We put on programs and we provide resources to other organizations to help communities grapple with and ask questions about the past, present, and the future. And Ollie's mission certainly marries well with that endeavor. Fourth, I want to thank the incredible staff of Virginia Humanities, many of whom you will see throughout the festival and who you'll see in the back crowded around the coffee area, who are helping us live stream, have no technical expertise whatsoever, but they're pitching in. No offense against you, Patty. I know you're awesome. But it certainly takes a village. They say it takes a village to raise a child, maybe, but it certainly takes a village to raise a festival of the book. And without our great staff, this also wouldn't be come to fruition. And last but certainly not least, Kalela Williams, our director for the Center for the Book, and Aaron Donovan, the assistant director for the Center for the Book. These two folks have created something truly miraculous and magical this year, and they didn't have long to do it. So my heart and my thanks go out to both of them, and I hope you can join me in giving them all a round of applause, and yourselves a round of applause for being here as well. So after this event, I invite you, of course, to peruse the schedule and see what else you'd like to go to. And right now, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and Nicholas.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to welcome all of you here today, not only here in the Virginia Humanities area, but also online. I'm Bill Adams. I'm a retired Air Force Research and Development Officer, and I was a consumer of intelligence when I was on active duty. So the material written about in the book was a predecessor to the agencies that fed me the information that I needed when I was doing my research. I'm happy to be here not only representing Virginia Humanities, but also the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I'm both an instructor as well as being on the board of directors there, and we're really privileged to be united with Virginia Humanities this year. It's the first year we've been able to do this, and it's also something that fits in very well with our mission, and I hope that you'll follow up with Ollie in the future. For those of you who are attending here in the facility, I ask that you silence your cell phones, turn them off, and if you do need restrooms, go through this door, just follow the signs. It's well signed, you won't get lost. You'll be able to find what you're looking for with no problem. We have a book seller on site. It'll be right back here. And after the discussion, we encourage you to buy a book if you haven't already done so. And Nicholas will be available to sign whatever books you buy. And we hope that you'll use that as an opportunity to get to know Nicholas and ask any questions that you might have not been able to ask during this time. One of the other things that we ask you to participate in is an evaluation of this session. You can either do it using your iPhone and a QR code that's available, or you can text via VA book to 56651, or use one of the QR codes that's in the facility here. And if you don't know what a QR code is, or you don't know how to use it, just ask one of the people on the staff around here. They'll have Virginia Humanities labels on them. And if all else fails, and for those of you who are online, you can go to vabook.org/feedback, and you'll get the questionnaire there. So whichever form you choose to use, please feel free to use it, and please feel free to provide the feedback, because it's a basis for future programs that we conduct. Just so that you'll know what to expect, you've got these introductory comments, and then I'll turn it over to Nicholas, and he'll spend about 10 minutes describing the book, the background, and whatever else he wants to say. And I'll ask questions for about 20 minutes, and then after that, it's open to you. Any questions you may have, anything that we may not have covered, anything you were wondering about. I'm curious, how many of you have already read the book? Okay, so there's at least some context. I asked that because both in my questions and in the answers that Nicholas provides, it's helpful to know if anybody knows what we're talking about. And I also realized that, unfortunately, not for me, but for many of you, World War II is ancient history. And so we have to keep that in mind. I find when I'm talking with other groups, I refer to the Vietnam War and World War II like yesterday, and I realize blank stares. It's ancient history as far as they're concerned. And it's been almost 80 years, or thereabouts, since World War II, so there's not too many of us around who remember. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nicholas, and he will discuss the book, Need to Know, World War II and the Rise of American Intelligence. Nicholas is a U.S. Marine Corps officer and CIA officer, retired. He's got a degree in history from Oxford, a doctorate in history, as well as a Juris Doctorate from UVA. So he's eminently qualified for this subject, and I'm sure he can answer any questions you can think of. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Bill, and let me just say, first of all, it's great to be here. I wrote a book about 5 years ago about Ernest Hemingway and espionage, and the first book festival that I went to was this one. So it's great to be back 5 years later. It's also great to be at an Ollie event, since I teach for Ollie up in the Washington metropolitan area at the George Mason campus. So real quick, I'm going to talk about a very broad outline of the book and why I wrote it, and then we'll go to the questions as Bill will explain. World War II is this massive subject, whether you're looking at it as history or as literature. There's just book after book about World War II. So why do we need yet another book about World War II? And my answer is this book does something that no other book does in quite the same way. There are all these books, but none of them, especially in the intelligence field, the books tend to be about one part, one activity, and they don't look at the whole. So you have a book about signals intelligence, you have a book about special operations, you have a book about espionage, and what I'm trying to do in this book is look at them all at the same time and then suggest some conclusions about how the country progressed from Pearl Harbor to VJ Day and laid the groundwork for the growth of intelligence in the post-war era. When you think, so before Pearl Harbor, almost nothing, not nothing, but almost nothing in terms of an intelligence machine, which was a term the British used to use, but you couldn't really do that in America because there were just sort of bits and parts, they weren't really assembled. By the end of World War II, you saw this massive, developing intelligence industries. They weren't really unified, but it's just such a change from like almost nothing to these machines and going from tens of people in the intelligence field to tens of thousands. It's just amazing growth. We retrench a little bit when the war ends, but then we grow again, and depending how you count, I think the accepted count these days is there are 18 intelligence agencies out there of various stripes. I think it's a secret how many people work there, and if you're a wag, you could say about half. But there are a lot of people working in intelligence. I think President George W. Bush said he was spending like $50 billion on intelligence, and even if you scale that back to what you had before World War II, there's almost no comparison between then and now. So in short, what I'm trying to do is introduce the subject, show how it grew during the war, and laid the foundations for post-war growth. So why me? This goes back to something Bill alluded to. I am really the child of the World War II generation. My parents weren't war heroes, but the war was the biggest event in their lives. So this is something I grew up with. I was born in 1950, and so you hear at the dinner table, you hear references that something Dad experienced or Mom experienced, and then people would come by the house. You would meet. I met Uncle Charlie. He flew fighters off a carrier in the Pacific, and he lost his toe. And he didn't really want to talk about the war, but there were these illusions that fed my curiosity. Same thing about the war in Europe. My mom experienced the siege of Budapest in 1945 as the Russians and the Germans battled for control of the city. And so this is, if you look at, for instance, Ukraine today, what's happening to people in Ukraine, there are events that change your life, and this was one of them. So that fed my curiosity about World War II, and I started being a student of World War II when I was a kid. I'm still a student of World War II. There's always one more thing, one more interesting fact, one more interesting story. And if you look at the list of books that are coming out, you'll see that World War II just doesn't stop. So for me, anyway, and for a bunch of other people, obviously, it's a great event and one that has some lessons for today. I didn't really write the book to teach lessons, but there are some lessons that it suggests that I can get into later on. And so I'll close with one thing that there's a great historian of intelligence, a man named David Kahn, who I believe is 94 today and still with us. And David wrote a book called Codebreakers, and it came out in the 1960s. And David was a journalist and a historian. He was not a government employee, so he had no lifetime review requirement for what he was writing. But this is the first book about code breaking to come out, the first serious book on this side of the Atlantic. And the publisher was so nervous that the publisher submitted it to the Pentagon and said, is it okay to say these things about World War II? So this is 25 years after the war, and the Pentagon shrugged its shoulders and said, yeah, go ahead and say them. And so today, these are things that we look back on and we go, that was a secret, even in the 60s. So David said to me, nobody, I've written about code breakers, but nobody's written broader. People tend to resist writing broader histories about the war. So that's what I tried to do, to write a broader history about the war and see if see how it was more than the sum of its parts, how American intelligence was greater than the sum of its parts. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to chatting with Bill and all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick.
You're welcome, Bill.
Proves you can get too close to these things. I was wondering, in your book you have a really extensive bibliography, and you have long acknowledgments, and you've got a whole bunch of names of major players up in the front. And that raised in my mind the question about whether you had the opportunity to talk with any individuals who were active during that period of time, if not the principals.
So to a limited extent, the answer is yes. In the 1970s, mostly when I was in England, and thereafter in the States, I talked to a few of the people who are in the book. I talked to Alan Dulles' special assistant. I talked to a German named Hans-Bernd Gisevius at some length, and he wasn't an American asset, but he was a German spy, and he sort of cooperated with Dulles in the resistance to Hitler. I talked to the author of a book called The Double Cross System. So at that point, it was a general background, and I didn't have notes that could be cited. So you don't see them in this book, but they were there to give me a background and a sense of who these people were and what their worldview was.
Okay, thank you. The intelligence community before the war appeared, at least in the book, to be limited to the Army and the Navy and perhaps the State Department. But the intelligence was a backwater. It was not something that was held in high repute in the services. It was what we would think of nowadays as tactical intelligence, which was not the big picture. It was the specific things that the service, be it Army or Navy, was responsible for and might have to do with specific actions that were underway. In general, it was not a processed intelligence. It was nothing that had been analyzed and selected so that a big picture was given to the decision makers. It was just raw intelligence that was fed up the chain. Is that an accurate representation?
I think so. There were some stories that were being developed that I would have put on the strategic, more like strategic information and strategic intelligence. But basically, you had great code breakers, especially in the U.S. Army. And before Pearl Harbor, they broke the Japanese diplomatic code, which was just a huge accomplishment that produced decrypts of the traffic that the Japanese ambassador was seeing. So President Roosevelt, Secretary of State, Secretary of War saw the same messages, sometimes earlier than the intended recipient. But it wasn't finished intelligence. It was just it was a raw decrypt. And so the briefer brought it to the consumer, handed it to him, and it would be like, tomorrow in the negotiations, stress this point. And then after 5 minutes, the briefer would take it away and it would be destroyed. And so there was no chance, or it wasn't impossible to synthesize, but it was very hard for the briefer, for the consumer to synthesize what he was seeing. And President Roosevelt was President Roosevelt was a guy who didn't have a feel for intelligence, and it was a relatively low priority for him. And his briefer talked to him while he was shaving in the morning, and he also had a terrible sinus condition, and the treatment in those days was to push gauze up into the nasal cavity. And so while his doctor is doing this, the briefers over here say, Mr. President, the Japanese ambassador has been instructed to do yes or this or that, and the president would kind of nod. But so yes, basically before the war, very, very little, and then during the war we see this tremendous growth.
Thank you. And before the war, at least the impression I got from the book was basically the strategic intelligence was amateur hour. It was some individual that the president might have selected, and maybe it was recommended by somebody else that he knew and respected and so forth. It was not an organization as we know it nowadays. And yet the British seem to be very active in encouraging the United States to develop a better capability. Could you speak to that?
Sure. The British had, around about the turn of the century, the early 1900s, the British create MI5 and MI6, so internal and external intelligence, and so this is what they need to run the empire, right? The British Empire is all over the globe. They say that the reason it was spread all over the globe was that the good Lord didn't trust them at night. But anyway, this was part of the machinery of government, and so it was just accepted as a matter of course that you're going to need these organizations. And Churchill grew up in that system and helped to develop it. So you see them as, in my book, they emerge justifiably as the reigning experts. So they're not perfect, but they're way better than we are, and they want us to join them, and they'll do whatever they can to get America into the war, and at the same time they want an American intelligence organization that can partner with them, that can funnel resources to them, and the other way around, that they can manipulate when they need to.
Okay, after the war, there appeared to be a move to generally dismantle many of the organizations that had been formed to support the war. And the Office of Strategic Services under Bill Donovan was one of those organizations that was selected. I was wondering if you had some insight or comment on how what evolved out of OSS, which was the Central Intelligence Agency to some extent, developed ultimately into 18, as you mentioned it, intelligence organizations in the government now.
So the big deal about World War II in American intelligence history is that at the end of the war, everyone doesn't go home. Yes, there's retrenchment. A lot of people are sent home, but there's a general consensus in Washington that we need a professional intelligence organization. And so, unlike previous wars, American intelligence has been around since George Washington, but the pattern up until World War II was generally you spent a lot of money on intelligence during the conflict, and then at the end of the conflict, you sent everybody home. You locked the doors, you lined out the budget, and then you waited till the next conflict, and then you did it all over again. So World War II is the first time that you really see people saying, this time we can't go back, we can't downsize to close to zero the way we did after previous wars. So Donovan does get sent home in September 1945, and he's bitterly disappointed that he's being sent home. But his ideas stay around in Washington, and that's the idea of a central intelligence agency. And the other important thing that Donovan did was get a generation of the American elite interested in intelligence as an activity and a profession. So he attracted a lot of academics, a lot of lawyers to Washington during the war. And these guys were bitten by the bug. And so you see them as CIA grows, you see them running CIA. in signals intelligence, it's more of an organic. The graph doesn't go up and down as much. You see kind of a more steady progression. And there are guys who have been doing code breaking since World War I, and they stay and they grow the organization, and they eventually learn how to work with each other. The Army and the Navy might have said that the Germans were the opposition, but the other service was the enemy. So it was just amazing to see before World War II and even well into the war, the competition between these two guys, between these two groups of code breakers. And the British play a huge role here too, because they have their Bletchley Park, and they have a separate liaison with the Army and the Navy. So when they come to Washington, it's like one day they're going to go through the agenda with one service, and then the next day they're going to go through the same agenda with the other service. And oftentimes the other service would say, well, you can't tell the Army that we just discussed this, okay? And so at close to the end of the war, the Brits say, we are really tired of doing everything twice. You guys better get on the same sheet of music. The next time we come to Washington, we're all going to sit in the same conference room and go over our agenda. And so at the end of the war, you see an agreement among the Army, Navy, and the British for post-war collaboration. And that's almost effortless. And even President Truman, who is learning on the fly, goes, yeah, sure, that's fine. And so we tend to forget when we're looking at what happened in 1945 that the continuation of a strong signals intelligence effort in collaboration with the British was accepted as a matter of course.
Okay, thank you. The book paints a picture of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, as an active player in the European theater of operations, which is what it was characterized at that time, and also a little bit in China, but not so much in the Pacific theater of operations. And I was wondering if you could speak to that and what the reasons were.
Surely, basically you have three in the Pacific. You have three big theaters. You have China, Burma, India, which is General Stilwell for most of the war, and then you have General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz. So Pacific Ocean areas, and I think Southwest PAC is the name of the other one. And Stilwell is kind of like, well, okay, if you must, and he will allow OSS into his theater on a limited basis. MacArthur said no, just no. If you want to send me intelligence officers, that's fine, but I will integrate them into my organization, and they will not function as a separate entity reporting to Washington. And Nimitz was somewhere in between the two views, but if you look at what Nimitz was doing, he's island hopping across the Pacific, and the kind of activities that OSS got into, especially in Europe, there's not a lot of scope for them. So that's why you see the big focus on Europe, and plus that's where they start out. That's always the main event for OSS, who tend to be America's Eastern elite, and what they're driven by is defeating Hitler and saving Europe from Nazis.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to turn it over to the audience here now. Any questions you may have to ask Nicholas?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, boy. Okay.
I have not yet read your book. So
Uh-oh.
this is a question
We
I
need to
didn't
talk.
have. What role do you think the immediate conflict with the Soviet Union played in any continuation of the intelligence institution?
So that's a great question. My book stops. So the question was, what role did the Soviet Union play in the continuation of American intelligence after the end of World War II? And in the period I consider, so I pretty much stopped in 1946 as sort of the CIA starts to take shape in the Central Intelligence Group. And so the Soviets start figuring in the equation a little later than that. What does figure in the equation is the atomic bomb. And so the Pearl Harbor is a huge consideration throughout. It kind of looms in the background of my book. We can't, the consequences of Pearl Harbor. They're more complicated than you can imagine. There's 6 or 7 Pearl Harbor investigations, and then there's the atomic bomb. And when you combine the two, you get the seniors in Washington in late 1945 saying, we can't have another Pearl Harbor, and we especially can't have another nuclear Pearl Harbor, atomic Pearl Harbor in those days, so we need the best intelligence we can get. And they realized that signals intelligence is not enough. Signals intelligence is great, but it's like relying on just one drug, or you have a complicated disease and you have one drug that treats a certain number of the symptoms, but you can't. It's not a drug that you can count on having all the time. So you need other things to keep the body healthy. You need exercise, you need diet, and so forth. So there's an argument that we need many kinds of intelligence to make sure that we don't have an atomic Pearl Harbor.
Did that answer the question? Any others?
How much did we have to co-opt from the group to get an organized intelligence professionalism, so to speak?
How much did we take from the Brits?
Or how much did they give us? How
Well,
much did they need to support us? I mean, or did we did our own thing?
So it's complicated. The Brits had a script for everything. Here's what you need to do.
Yeah.
And Donovan paid a fair amount of attention to that, and that. So the general outlines of OSS come in large part from the British, who say, here's the game plan. And Donovan actually didn't want to be in intelligence. Donovan wanted to be a combat leader. And he said this over and over again at the beginning of the war, and the British just twisted his arm and said, there's nobody else, you gotta do it. In signals intelligence, it's a little more complicated. The British did some of the same things, but it was a slower process and less direct. The British had a different, so they broke the Enigma machine. The German looked like a glorified typewriter in a wooden box, and that was a huge success. But we had our own success. We had the guys who broke the Japanese code, and Secretary Stimson came to Washington. He's 72 years old when he comes to Washington in 1940, and he stays for the war. So he leaves at 77 or 78, and just a crushing load. And he supports signals intelligence during the war. After earlier saying, "Gentlemen, don't read." Like 10 years earlier, he said, "Gentlemen, don't read each other's mail." But he brings a bunch of New York lawyers to Washington, and he says, "Fix intelligence. Fix what we're doing in signals intelligence, because we have these raw transcripts that can you make this system work better?" And these guys do. There's a guy who's in the book, Alfred T. McCormick, and he's a Wall Street lawyer in a white shoe law firm. Very wealthy. Cravath, Swaine and Moore, still one of the leading firms in the country, and he says he comes up with a system for turning information into intelligence, and he does it basically for $1 a day for as long as it takes for the duration of the war. If you work for McCormick, you work 13 out of 14 days. You get there about 7 in the morning. You go home when your work's done. It's assumed that'll be 7 or 8 at night, and you get every 14th day off. So he himself he pushed himself harder than he pushed his employees. And there's like little bits of paper here and there, and he's asking for a couple of hours off. He's going up the chain. So this is a really senior guy, a very wealthy guy, a name partner, or not quite a name partner, but a managing partner of his law firm. And during the war, he has to ask for a few hours off to do things. So I hope does that answer your question? So the Brits for OSS, and we on our own, basically, for American signals intelligence. But the Brits do play some role in that. Yes, sir?
I'm interested in how intel gets utilized and the lunge and parry that goes on when it hits statecraft, such as the importance, I mean, how could you ever overemphasize the importance of the Enigma, breaking that without that we would have never stopped North Africa, because they had to evidently mask the fact that we had it, and so they act like they bumped into those convoys when they knocked them out.
So,
The story about Churchill not knowing about Coventry,
Right.
couldn't do anything, and
So-
seeing it. But then you had our president now going public with the
Right.
Ukraine intel for a totally different reason. So,
So-
that thing of cover your ass versus
okay, so here's the way I interpret your question. It's kind of like when you use intelligence, you run the risk of betraying the fact that you got it, right? And so the example that's often talked about is Churchill knew that the Germans were going to bomb a certain city, and he didn't send the information down to that level because he wanted to protect the source. And in the British were much more conservative about protecting the sources than we were. As the war went on, we were pretty aggressive about using intelligence. A good example is shooting down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft in, was it 43? And that is something that the Brits just took a deep breath and said, "You did that?" I mean, it was a pinpoint. You know, they had to calculate a pinpoint in the air and like fly 8 or 9 hours and do the timing and time, space, and distance. I'm never any good at math, but you remember all those calculations in grade school, and they did it. It was just a phenomenal thing. And the Brits said, I mean, you might as well have just sent Tokyo a message that you read their traffic. In the end, Tokyo didn't come to that conclusion and said it was accidental. But yes, we Americans tended already in World War II to be more aggressive about using intelligence and risking the compromise of the source. Yes, sir.
In your opening remarks, you said that there was that you would discuss later the consequences and lessons learned from that time in today's terms. So I'll ask the question.
Okay.
that you
Well,
answered.
so there's a lot of things I can talk about, but one of the things, why should you read my book? One of the themes is professionalism, right? So if you look at the history of intelligence without using the filters that I propose, you see the code breaking and you go, oh, hey, that's terrific. They broke the Japanese code, and it was a huge accomplishment, but it's not really finished intelligence. And so what I'm saying is we need to look at both parts of the process and see how you need to introduce professionalism into the equation to get finished intelligence that you can make the best use of. Another lesson learned I like to talk about is kind of the greatest generation. And yeah, I'm biased. My parents were, that was my parents' generation. And something Tom Brokaw wrote that book praising the greatest generation. I wonder, have we gone overboard? Have we gone too far in that direction as historians and writers? And the short answer is probably not. I really like the way everyone came together in World War II. And the country was terribly divided before the war. And when the war started, it was like, okay, that was yesterday, this is today. And people who hated Roosevelt, absolutely hated Roosevelt, they didn't let that influence them, and they were loyal to the administration and the country. So I like seeing the country pulling together, and that's one of my lessons learned from the book. Yes, sir.
In your earlier remarks, you said Vincent stood up in MI5 and MI6 early in the 20th century. And in fact, most other global players, France, Tsarist Russia, Japan, all had intelligence services well before that. And yet, as you pointed out, in 29, our Secretary of State said, John would normally open up his jail. And even today, often in the context of political debate in this country, spying is an unpleasant word. It's got a nasty connotation. In your opinion, is there anything about our American political culture, our national